Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cadlow, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen.
Welcome to Strength Chat with your host. That's right. Wow, this sounds totally different without the headphones on. It's just not the same feeling, but welcome to Strength Chat with your host, Chris Duffin. To my very far right, we've got the wizard of training, Mr. Brandon Sen, with us today. We are missing Dr. Rudolph today, but standing in is the man with no voice, Mr. Brady Cable.
I don't know how I feel that one's stuck.
I don't know.
Forever my intro now.
It actually more accurate than the man of many skills, because he does like basically everything in the company for us at some level or another. So anyway.
Also that.
Don't let that go to your head, though.
Call him Professor Brady. And Dr. Rudolph and Professor Brady.
Professor Brady.
Yeah.
So, this is Dr. Rudolph is not here because we've got a very busy week. We got travel. We're heading out to the CSCCA, the College Strength and Conditioning convention out in Kansas City, which brings up flying, and I'm really anticipating this flight going better than my last week. So I got a little story to tell about a little trip to Hawaii. Hawaii is supposed to be fun and enjoyable. And it was indeed fun and enjoyable. But the way back, I woke up the day we're supposed to take the flight. I took my wife with me and the youngest of my three kids. She's a year and a half. And I woke up, my stomach was just in knots. I'm laying in bed there going, God, I don't know what I'm going to do. I can't get moving. Of course, my daughter's sitting there laying 90 degrees to me, kicking my bloated belly, because it was bloated at this point, like whale balloon. And so Jacqueline starts finally packing the bags for us because I wasn't moving. And then we're just about ready to be too late to the flight. I finally go in the bathroom and I left a really giant tip for the house cleaners. We'll put it that way. But I heaved all over the place. It was horrible.
In the hotel?
In the hotel. So filled up the sink, overflowed onto the floor. It was just
why not the toilet?
It was just.
It's got to be right there.
I couldn't make it to the toilet. Trust me. The pain was too bad that I couldn't bend. I don't know how to describe it. It was pretty brutal. And I'm like, okay, I got this. So we grab the bags and we go to the airport. By the way, I'm obviously not feeling too great, right? So get to the airport. We can't check in. So go stand in line for 45 minutes. We're already running late, right? In the heat, because did I mention it's Hawaii? It's a
Hawaii
little hot.
airport, yeah, it's terrible for that.
And so get to the counter. Boarding passes are being printed, handing to us. She's putting the tags on the bags, and I end up on all fours at the front counter, heaving into the person brought me over a garbage can, when I heaved into a plastic bag I happened to be carrying with me. But I've got tears running down my face. It's so bad, cramping abdominals. And so they're like, yeah, so we need you to step over to the side here. So they call in an EMT. 2 police officers show up. Luckily, one recognized me. That was kind of cool. But anyway, so they're trying to get me to go to the hospital via ambulance. I'm like, no, that's not happening. So they won't let us board, and they put me on a flight ban. So they're like, you can't fly until you get a physician's this formal letter or whatever it is, and you got to go to a clinic. And I'm like, I did not feel up for that. So call the hotel. Oh yeah, I was supposed to have a vasectomy done the next day too, by the way.
Maybe that's a sign.
I had to reschedule. I know it was as clear as day that was not supposed to happen. So anyway, I'll try to speed up the story a little bit. So reschedule hotel, get back. I end up going. I was speaking at the University of Hawaii. So I go up to their clinic because I talk to the coaches, get in there. They write me up a letter. So wake up the next morning. I'm like, oh, okay. I haven't had any food for 36 hours or something. I'm like, I actually feel like I could eat, have a little food, have a nice relaxed morning, hanging, chilling on the deck with my wife and my daughter. We get through airport security. Daughter takes a nap. Everything is just smooth as can be. We're like, yes, this is the day. We're all good. And I get on the plane, and my daughter starts screaming. and she's screaming the whole trip, and wife's not feeling too hot. So I end up having, it's a 6-hour flight, like baby duty the whole time. And about halfway through the flight, wife starts not feeling too good. Then she starts getting up and running to the bathroom, puking and diarrhea nonstop. And so she's over there like head just trying to hold herself together. I got this like mountain lion in my lap trying to like run loose on the plane and scream. Like I'm like, I don't even know. I still don't feel great. It's a 6-hour flight of dealing with it. Not great. When we start getting close to Portland, we're taxiing down, and our daughter pukes all over me, everywhere, just like all over, and then starts puking on Jacqueline. Like we had this bag already prepped for Jacqueline, so luckily we caught a lot of. I couldn't believe how much came out of her. So get off the plane. We barely make it to baggage claim because gotta run to the bathroom again, because I'm still going to the bathroom, by the way, like very frequently myself. So somehow we made it home. I don't know how Jacqueline made it through the car ride. The 15 minutes home was just covered in puke, like sick. We get to the house and she goes running inside, and so I take the baby in, hand it to her because I got to go use the other bathroom. They're in the bathtub. She's like puking and crying with the baby. Oh, it was anyway. That was our trip back from Hawaii.
What'd you get? What were you sick with? Food?
It couldn't have been food because they hit us about 36 hours apart. So it had to be some sort of stomach flu. So don't know where it came from, but definitely was freaking brutal. The worst flying experience I've ever been through. Like it was just, I can't describe how horrendous it is. So
do you think that was worse than what you did to Scott Mendelson that one time?
Oh yeah.
Oh
yeah. Well, let's not dive into that story though.
Maybe for another episode.
But speaking of flying, we've got a guest on today who just dropped his helicopter into our parking lot to show up for the podcast. So we thought, let's do that. So
and I didn't throw up, not sick.
No sick. And you're totally desiring to have kids right now too, right?
Yeah, it sounds awesome.
Yeah, you're like, this sounds like the ticket.
I'll keep the helicopter, save the kids for later.
Let's trade in the helicopter.
I feel like it's one or the other.
Let's go make some babies.
Yeah, it's hard. People always like, oh, how do you have all these toys? I'm like, I don't have kids.
That was the first response you gave me when I
mean,
asked you.
helicopters at least 3 or 4 kids.
Yeah, easy.
Yeah, I prefer to fly, stick it in, when I'm done with it, I can leave it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mess with me.
So actually, really excited to have on Joel Jamieson today. So Joel is with 8WeeksOut. Joel, God, I've been following you since you first really started HRV. I was an early adopter of your first run with Bioforce. And then you've transitioned and grown that platform and the knowledge base and all that. So Joel spends a lot of time in the mostly like the MMA community, but really solid.
I'd say conditioning as a whole.
You're
branched out a lot.
Yeah, you're growing way outside of that.
Yeah.
But really managing the conditioning aspects around athletes as they manage their training through annually, but also preparation for competition, and certifying coaches in the methodology. So really extensive training platform, and just
variety of stuff.
Yep, variety of stuff. So HRV, so heart rate variability, and we'll dive into the concepts around that, but is another objective measure of autoregulation. And so really looking forward to this discussion and just learning a little bit more about what you're doing, Joel.
Yeah, I remember talking to you years ago about Bioforce and HRV, going back and forth. So it's cool to finally be down here, sitting here and talking about it. And it's definitely was more into the, I would say, endurance athlete type community, and then I introduced it largely into the MMA world. But it's definitely grown. I mean, Apple now has HRV on the Apple Watch, so it went from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, no one had a clue what HRV was, to now everyone's at least heard of it. I mean, maybe they don't quite get it, but most out there have heard of it or seen it or know something about it. So it's really been interesting to watch that progression from no one's ever heard of this thing to everyone's using it or has on their phone, or Apple's incorporating it and that kind of stuff. So yeah,
it's been pretty crazy because when there was just a couple companies in the game when you started.
Oh yeah,
and nobody.
No, I mean I started back in 2001 or so, 2002 with a company called the Omega Wave, and that was way ahead of its time. I saw this thing. I'm like, what the hell is that? He's plugging electrodes into me, and this Russian guy has me laying down on this couch, and he's telling me my aerobic fitness sucks. And I'm like, how the hell do you know that? I mean, he's right. How the hell does he know that at the time? So it was so. I mean, this is before mobile phones really had even caught on. So the idea that this guy could plug all these electrodes into me off a laptop and tell me anything about my fitness and my recovery was just, mind blowing to me. So the funny thing was, at the time, I'm like, this thing's amazing. Like, how much is this thing? And he's like, 35,000.
Yeah, I was
like,
right
35,000.
It was about 30.
I'm like, well, I have like
$350.
$350. Like, I just started my gym. I was pretty. Actually, no, I hadn't even started my gym at that point. I remember, but I was, I didn't have 35 grand, so kind of the little back room. I'm kind of fortunate they're Russian. I could do a little shady dealing here and there. Essentially, convinced him I would help introduce it to the people that I knew in the industry, and worked out a payment plan, and he convinced him essentially to let me start using the thing. So that was really the beginning. And again, that was almost 20 years ago now. So it's been a long time of looking at HRV data for sure.
Yeah. Well, let's start by let's give our audience like the primer on the science behind HRV. So just like the dictionary or Wikipedia, like nice, clear, like summary. What makes it work? How does it?
Yeah, I'll give you kind of the way that I think makes the most sense to people. And if we look at our brains and how our bodies work, they're designed to essentially handle different types of environments and situations, right? So if you look evolutionarily, we sometimes had to go be hunter-gatherers and go out and get food, or we had to run away from animals or whatever chasing us. Like, and sometimes we need to sleep and rest and digest, right? So there's all these different scenarios that we're designed to survive, right? So in order to do that, the brain has this thing it uses called the autonomic nervous system. And people are familiar with the central nervous system because it's what helps us move and walk and do all these things. But the autonomic nervous system is essentially what prepares the body and makes us able to accomplish all these different tasks. And the way that does that is by managing energy. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. So the autonomic nervous system has two halves. It's got the fight or flight, which most people have heard of, the stress response system. And that system's job is to direct energy into working muscles, into the brain. It's basically designed to shuttle energy where you need it for fight or for flight. Makes sense, right? Now, it's got this other half called the parasympathetic system, which is the opposite. It's the rest and digest. Its job is to funnel energy into tissues, into repair, into remodeling, into rebuilding, into digestion, into all these sorts of recovery-driven things that help the body repair itself from all the stress that it's exposed to during the rest of the day. So those two branches, again, they work together. If we need to produce lots of energy, lots of force and power because we're lifting weights or we're doing conditioning or whatever it is that we're doing, that sympathetic system is going to turn on and we're going to see all this energy diverted to that area. When we're resting and repairing and digesting, we're going to see the parasympathetic system turn on more so that it's driving energy into repairing those tissues. And so it's the balance of those two systems that's ultimately responsible for making sure you have the energy to produce the force you need to lift weights or to meet the demands of the stressor. And then the parasympathetic system's job is to make sure you have the energy diverted into rebuilding the tissues. So they work together, like I said, to coordinate everything. And really what HRV is doing is just looking at the activity of that parasympathetic nervous system. So we're essentially looking directly at where is the body shifting energy. So if we see the parasympathetic system is really low, we inherently know that sympathetic system is more active and it's diverting energy into the bloodstream and working muscles and all these sorts of things. If the parasympathetic system is really high, we know energy is being diverted more into recovery and repair and regeneration, which is obviously, you need both to get bigger, stronger, faster, leaner, whatever. You've got to train the body, which means you need the sympathetic system, and then you've got to put all the energy into recovering from that training so you actually get bigger, stronger, faster, or whatever. So it's just looking at the balance between those two systems by measuring the parasympathetic side. So again, it tells us what the body is doing. And if we see lots of stress, we don't see the parasympathetic system driving recovery, then all the training in the world doesn't matter because the energy isn't there to repair itself and make itself bigger and stronger. So I think that's kind of the big picture for people that are training is understanding like there's a limited amount of energy your body can produce. It's not unending. So it's got to manage that. And if it's putting all its energy into dealing with stress of training and life and everything else, then there's not enough energy for the parasympathetic system to do its job, repair and digest and regenerate. Then you don't get the gains that you saw despite putting in the effort. So that's what HRV is really showing us is in a nutshell. Maybe it wasn't a nutshell. It's basically showing us that balance of that big picture of energy production within the body and where it's going.
And so HRV is the measurement of the intervals of heartbeats at rest.
Basically, yeah. It's looking at, so you have your heartbeat, obviously, in a certain number of times per minute. But what's influencing that is that autonomic nervous system. And at rest, the more active that parasympathetic nervous system is, the more variation there is from one beat to the next. So it's essentially looking at the pattern of the heart rate rather than just the heart rate itself. And the interesting thing is, it was developed in like the 1950s by the Russians, who were sending astronauts to space for the first time, cosmonauts. And back then, they were like had no real clue. Like, what happens when you shoot someone in space? No one had ever done it. So what's the effects on the human body? Nobody really knew. It was all speculation to send somebody up into space. So what they figured out was in the heart rate signal that they could send back from space, which is about the only thing they could figure out how to send back at the time physiologically. They started realizing that this heart rate signal, they could decode it to get more information out of it. And so that's literally where HRV was developed, was for the Russian space program. And it was used by literally the first man in space named Yuri Gagarin in whatever year it was that he went up there. I should know that. But that's really where the technology was created, was for Russian astronauts to see what the hell happened to them when you shot them up in the upper atmospheres.
That's a really cool piece of history. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I mean, literally, so here's more history that's interesting too. So that's where it started, and then over the next decades, the Russians use it for space space work and medicine. And in the 80s, they started looking at it from an athletic population. They said, well, we can use this to measure athletes, and so they started this whole project, and they were essentially collecting data from all these Russian athletes and developing the technology for athletic performance. Well, right, in the middle of that, the whole Russian collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed, and so the whole thing just completely fell apart. And all the scientists that had worked on it just kind of dispersed. I mean, most of them left the Soviet Union at that point in time because it was no longer the Soviet Union. Fast forward like 10, 15 years, there was 2 or 3 guys. And the interesting thing is a lot of these guys come from the track world for whatever reason, because the Russians were so dominant in Olympic events back then, especially the Summer Olympics. So the Russians somehow, like 3 or 4 of them, end up in Oregon. Right here,
I was going to say,
because they ended up in Eugene originally. So they ended up in a track meet somewhere in Oregon, and there's 3 or 4, I can't remember the exact number of these guys that had originally worked on the project in the 80s for the Russians, and they were just kind of shooting the breeze, talking about this technology, and then they said, hey, we should finish this project. And so they literally, that was where the Omega Wave was born, was starting to rekindle this old Russian technology that never quite got finished off. And they brought it together and created the Omega Wave, which is really the first commercial use of HRV, which again I was introduced to, in the early 2000s. So it was, it's an interesting story. It definitely, people like to, talk about the Russians just being drug abusing, mass numbers of people. I mean, sure, they use drugs, there's no doubt, but I think most of the world back then did. But I don't think they were nearly as just intensity, volume, crazy, people that drove everybody to the ground. Like everything I've learned from talking to a lot of the guys back then was, no, they did blood testing every week. They were using this starting to look at how to use technology. They were doing all kinds of recovery things. Like, yes, they trained high volumes, but they developed those over their lifetime, from the youth on up. And they were much more mindful about those things than people give credit for.
Anybody that's read any of the old Russian textbooks can tell it's a very scientific approach to methodology and analysis.
Yeah, they absolutely did. And the good thing is they had Verkhoshansky and Zatziorsky, these kind of overall scientific minds that would disseminate the information to all the coaches across the country, because they had a singular goal of making Russia better, winning more gold medals. We don't really have that in the U.S. I mean, how many athletes really even train in Olympic training centers? I mean, not a huge percentage. So it's a completely different model over here. I think we you get people believing everything they read on, the internet with no filter. Over there, you have these high-level PhDs, kind of seeing some of the information, getting it out there, and they had just a much better educational platform, I would say, especially for 70s and 80s. They were years ahead of us in terms of that.
So how is your use and application of this transition through the years? Because I know you started with using Omega Wave on athletes, and then you ended up, because of the direction that they went, ended up launching Bioforce.
Yep.
And then that's kind of grown into Morpheus.
Yep. I mean, I think so.
And so,
the initial, like I said, it was $35,000, so you were pretty much limited to whoever was in front of you that you could measure. And it was a complicated 6 electrodes and chest electrodes. It was not an easy thing to deal with. So it was really just limited to the athletes that I trained, on a daily basis, which was mostly MMA athletes and then some youth athletes. And then over time, I realized, once mobile phones started progressing, that this technology, I couldn't imagine training anybody without it once I got so used to it, because I could manage their volume, their intensity. I could see what was going on and make all adjustments.
Especially remote. So we deal with clients remotely. Having feedback, whatever subjective, objective, you've got to you can't just go, here's the plan, go run with it, right?
That's the first thing you learn is you put 2 or 3 or however many athletes you want through the exact same program. They could look like they're the same fitness level. They could look like everything would be the same. and it's never the same because sleep and nutrition and mental stress and their sports training, I mean, all these variables come into play. Genetics. I mean, there's so many things that will have you get completely different responses to the same program. So, yeah, when basically the part of the genesis of that story with Bioforce was we had all these Japanese fighters coming over from Pride, and so we trained them for a fight, and they go back to Japan, and I'd use the system with them when they were with me, and then they'd be gone, and I'm like, I don't know what the hell to tell you to do because I know how variable the results you see are, and if I tell you, one thing and you go do it, maybe it's totally wrong. So that was where I kind of realized like I need to figure out how we can get HRV out there to more people, and especially in a distance scenario, so we could track this data, and that was where Bioforce was born back in like 2011. So created Bioforce.
God, then I must have been like that very
early,
first year. Yeah,
it was early 2011 and then 2012. So we created that and really built it into with thousands and thousands of users all over the world, lots of sports teams and military units and all that. And then basically what I realized over time was it took more effort than a lot of people wanted to necessarily put in to analyze the data because, again, I'd been doing this for 10 years at the time, so I was pretty familiar with what I was seeing. But you take the average person and you show them a bunch of lines in an HRV graph, and I'm like, what the hell does that mean? And there was a challenge there of how do they apply it. So I wrote a book that went with it, but how many people really want to spend the time reading the book? I mean, certainly some will, but your average person going to the gym doesn't want to read a 150-page book to use an app and to use it. So
I read that book.
Yeah, well, you read the book. You're probably,
I actually completely forgot about it till now.
Yeah.
Until you mentioned it, I'm like, oh yeah, there was a book.
Yeah, I mean, there was a book.
Yeah, it was pretty big too.
Yeah, it was. But again, it was a small number of people that were going to take that initiative and then dig in the data. Like, not many are engineers by trade. So really, the idea was developing the next generation of this tool was Morpheus, and the idea was like, let's look at the bigger picture, not just HRV, but also sleep and mental stress and all the training data and just this big picture of things that drive recovery and conditioning, and then turn that into something that people can instantly use. So Morpheus essentially looks at all the big picture. Again, looks at your sleep, your HRV, your training, all these things that really drive the recovery side of things, and then it gives you heart rate zones. So it redefines, okay, today I'm going to go in the gym. It gives you a very specific heart rate if your goal is to improve conditioning, and it helps you manage your heart rates essentially to get best results. So that's one thing I realized is conditioning has been, and the heart rate training and conditioning has been broken forever because who the hell uses 5 zones, and who knows what those 5 zones mean, and who's going in there and actually doing heart rate training correctly. Like most people go in the gym.
I guarantee you, not me.
Yeah, they go in the gym, they wear their heart rate monitor, right?
Yeah, well, yours is fear avoidance. Keep it low.
Oh, my heart rate's going up.
Yeah.
I better sit down. Where's my chair?
Yep,
Where's my training chair? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're a strength and power athlete, obviously, so you have a little bit more luxury of not having to worry about as much. But your average person that's going in, they're just wearing a heart rate monitor, they're just doing a bunch of intervals, and they're really not using the heart rate very effectively. It's just on, and they're just tracking it, but they don't really know what to do with it. So again, I want to create Morpheus to take their recovery and say, okay, based on that, here's the heart rates you should be in for today, and give people a much more directed guidance of whether they're just going in and doing some random conditioning or cardio. They're actually given specific heart rates to train at if their goal is to improve that. And the funny thing is, if you mention the word conditioning, I've been talking about this lately, if your average person's like, I don't need conditioning, I don't really do conditioning. Mm-hmm. But then we're like, what do you do in the gym? Oh, I go on the bike, or I do a spin class, or I'm like, that's conditioning, right? Like if you say, hey, do you do cardio? Everyone's like, oh yeah, I do cardio. Well, that is basically driving conditioning. So I think the best way for people to think about it is if you go to the gym to lift weights to get stronger, you could say, well, I go to the gym to do cardio to improve my conditioning. So I think there's a disconnect there with the word people use as cardio, but really you're doing cardio to improve your conditioning, whether you realize it or not. So I think if you look at conditioning, it's not something that just athletes do. It's something that most people go in the gym do on some capacity. They just don't all necessarily do as effectively as they could. So that was really kind of the idea behind Morpheus was create a really good conditioning tool that personalizes the whole process, gives them the big picture recovery, and helps them manage all that.
So I'm guessing with that system, like if you're seeing the need for recovery, it's suggesting training in a zone that is going to to help improve that recovery.
Yep, it's got basically three colored zones. So it gives you a blue zone, which is that zone that's going to promote recovery. It gives you a green zone, which is a zone that's going to promote conditioning. And then it gives you a red zone, which is basically your max intensity. It doesn't mean you don't train there. It just means be aware that the more time you spend in that zone, the more stress you're going to impart, and the longer it's going to take to recover from it. And then what it also does, which is really cool, is after the workout, it'll show you the impact by adjusting your recovery from what it was to start with. So if you go in at 90% and you do a really hard workout, it's going to drop it, maybe in the 70s, which allow you to gauge what the effects of that workout were. If you went and did a shorter, brief recovery type workout, you might even see the score go up a little bit. So it's a way for you to gauge, how hard was that workout for my body and what were the effects of it, so that I can help, basically be better at planning and make sure that I'm getting out with a workout what I intended to, versus thinking I went really easy, but actually I didn't. So it's just, again, it's taking the heart rate data and looking at all that and analyzing it for you.
Yeah, I think that's an important, like, thinking you're working hard or thinking you're getting something's delivering results, and the actual, being in that, I'm thinking from a strength training perspective or whatever, but like there's a lot of misses out there that, we see it all the time when people, try to subjectively auto-regulate without having some sort of guidance around it. I don't know if either you two have some thoughts on that matter, but it seems like there's definite gaps in that regard.
Yeah, I think there can be gaps in almost anything, and it's really comes down to the effectiveness of the individual to understand. And that's the thing that I noticed when you gave us a preview of Morpheus when we were at your facility, was how simple the interface was.
Yep.
So what I've seen in previous in our world, we're using velocity a lot with our athletes, and we often don't recommend the really high-end devices because the data is so convoluted that it's nice to have, but it's like at the end of the day, you're only going to use like 5% of those data points. So why wouldn't we use something that's a little bit more simpler? And simple doesn't necessarily mean it's not as effective. It just gives you exactly what you need. I
can straight up tell you, this is like, from a business perspective, I've found it over and over again when I was doing a lot of that, because it's the same thing. Like, what are the pieces you're looking at? And if you look at like 100 different things, what action am I going to take? You're going to sit there as a staff and argue about all these little things. And what does this mean? And this mean? And this mean? Like, you've got to like refine it down, but you've also got to really understand what that's going to deliver. Because if you get it off, you're going to chase the wrong thing and you're going to win that and make whatever that is look better. And sometimes that isn't what you actually want at the end. So simple does not mean simple.
I think actually it's harder to take.
It's harder
to make something really complex, really simple, than to sound smart or to use lots of data that doesn't actually mean shit.
It is really hard to take something and draw it down. Because here's because back when I was using the Bioforce, I was also pairing and using Omega Wave at the same exact time, and you had more data with yours, but it wasn't over the top. Omega Waves was really simplified down, but it was so dumbed down that it was completely unusable. Like, within a month, I'm like, this is pointless, and I quit using it entirely.
It's hard to find
that was the new. That wasn't the Omega Wave that you were. That wasn't the $35,000 Omega Wave.
That one had lots and lots of data. That was totally
no. It was the very pair. So yeah, simple does not mean simple. It's actually, like I said, it's
complicated to get. It's funny how complex it is to make something simple.
Yeah,
it's a paradox, but that's the way it is.
And Chris, I think something you were alluding to earlier was that with velocity, we found that people's perception doesn't always match up with what the actual data is showing. I was curious, Joel, how often do you find that when somebody is trying to go for that recovery type workout and they feel like they're doing that they're not actually working that parameter?
There's a huge, I'll tell you, the one thing you learn after years of looking at this data is just how much individual, variations there are. Some people are pretty in tune and have developed that kinesthetic awareness, if you want to call it that. And a lot of people, the majority, I would say, just totally aren't. And a lot of it kind of depends on what their mindset was to start with. Like, a combat athlete or a military guy is going to tell himself, like, he's way better than he really is, versus your average couch potato is probably going to look at the exact opposite and like, they trash themselves and they're probably just fine. So it totally depends on the person, their mindset, kind of how they've been wired and what their goals are. But I would say, I would say by and large, I would say more people are inaccurate than are accurate. I would say that to get more accurate, you have to get further and further away from normal. Like, if you were really in the toilet, like, your average person can figure that out. But it's more about those little variations where, you're not really trashed or you're not really, completely fresh, where people have a very hard time reading, the kind of normal variations that you'd see. It's really only the edges where everyone's like, okay, I'm trashed, or okay, I'm completely rested, or whatever. So it definitely depends. But I would say your average person is probably worse at that kind of stuff than they are.
Yeah, and that was kind of my observation is, I wasn't saying everybody's off. But usually your bulk, within the bell curve are not hitting it.
The other thing I would say is we get a lot of questions like, oh, my recovery didn't look great today, but I went in and smashed a record. Okay, that's not necessarily what we can predict with HRV. We can't necessarily say, hey, your HRV is this or that, therefore you're going to perform at X or Y level. What we can say is your body is putting a lot of energy into one system or the other. So what we can do more effectively than that is say, if you go in and do 100% workout, it's going to take you maybe 5 days to recover if you're starting from a lower recovery score. If you're starting that same workout from a higher recovery score, you're going to recover in maybe 3 days or 3.5 days. We can predict the recovery time, I would say, better. We can predict your actual performance. It's not designed to say, hey, you're going to go out and hit this exact weight today, or you're going to go run this time. That's what we can't. One number will never tell you that, but we can just tell you what your body's doing, which will give us an idea of how long it's going to take you to recover from this workout. Because what people miss is, is 5 workouts a week better or worse than 2 workouts where you smash yourself? There's questions. It's not always an easy answer, right? So sometimes training more frequently but not running yourself in the ground is going to produce the longer, more consistent result than trash myself and taking 6 days to recover from it, right?
Yeah, I was gonna just reiterate on that point, saying even though it can't predict like here's going to be your maximal day, you're going to have better performance in the long run if you're managing your training plan appropriately.
Yes, absolutely. And you can look at
that's not a miss.
No, you can look at the trends, right?
Yeah.
Like we had a bunch of data from the NFL team, and we could see their starting quarterback go like this, big downward trend until his injury, and we could see the interesting thing was the backup quarterback was kind of maintaining that for the whole season, and then you'd see as soon as he got the starting job, kaboom, same thing. So you can see literally like these patterns of things based on people's activity. If you look at the long-term trends, like they will tell a story of performance, but just on a daily basis, I can't predict from one day what your performance is going to be on that day or the next day. If I looked back for 6 months or even 6 weeks or 3 weeks, those trends would probably give me some ideas. But again, people make this mistake of thinking, well, HRV wasn't accurate because I went in and smashed the weight and my HRV was low. Like, it's not that simple.
Yeah. It's not that simple. From a pure strength world, you can understand why we rely on the velocity, because it is going to tell you that.
That is
today. Like where are we at?
Yep.
And like good chance that I've got to, I can hit some crazy numbers. You're going to see that.
Yep. And you mentioned external, external load factor,
but actually
right?
combining those two together would be like really incredibly optimal.
Yeah,
so,
I think that's absolutely the more. Yeah. But again, the question is, how do we pull that data in? And make it really simple. And
what do you take action?
And
what pieces do you take action on?
Yeah, exactly.
Because again, data overload is not necessarily going to do you any good.
And so also I was interested in too with Morpheus is because anytime we're at these conventions, we see all these cool technology companies, like you have your sleep guys, you have your nutrition guys, you have your hydration guys, you have your VBT guys, and you almost have to choose which one of those you want to invest in, because you can't do them all, because you're only going to have so much buy-in from your athletes. So with Morpheus, it does have integration of various types of sleep apps and things like that.
Yeah, so we can basically pull in 2 types of data from just about any app out there, and that's activity, so steps, calories per day, and then sleep. So, people have an Oura Ring, if people have a Fitbit, if people are using their Apple Watch, whatever it is people are using, for the most part, we can pull activity and sleep in. We use the Morpheus band itself to measure HRV, and then we could record training from pretty much any heart rate monitor out there. So I try to be as open as possible. I'm not forcing you to wear any device 24/7. If you don't even want to wear any device, you can manually tell it how many hours you slept and let your phone track your activity for you. So I try to pull the major pieces, which in my mind are activity, which obviously is the biggest thing, so it's driving how much energy you're expending a day. Sleep, which is hugely important for overall function in about every system in the human body, right? Yep. HRV, like I talked about, and then training. I mean, those are the biggest drivers of recovery, performance, and the whole 9 yards of fitness. So Morpheus will take all that aggregate information and say, boom, here's what it means. Here's your recovery score. And then, boom, here's your heart rate zone today based on that. So, again, I try to make it as adaptable to people's preferences and devices, so you don't have to go out and have 10 different devices to track this stuff. Whatever it is you're using, we can pull that data in 9 times out of 10, and then let Morpheus essentially do the number crunching for you, so you're not like, what the hell does this mean? And then, again, translate that into what you do in the gym.
And it could still even be applicable for strength and power athletes, even if they're not readily involved in conditioning, because they're going to see those scores develop over time and potentially be able to develop more effective blocks based on those trends.
Yeah, another really fascinating area of HRV, which I didn't talk about, is when we expose our body to lots of stress, particularly muscle fibers firing over a long period of time with lots of load, we produce lots of inflammation, right? Inflammation is what starts the repair process. It's what signals the body like, hey, this tissue needs to be rebuilt, and it's part of the whole process of remodeling. the parasympathetic's job is to go in and facilitate that repair by creating, essentially that process in the body. It's anabolic, it stimulates recovery and repair, and then it's to turn off inflammation at the same time. So we see this huge broad correlation between inflammation and HRV changing up or down. So you'll see that trend, even though traditionally people would think of HRV in endurance terms and conditioning terms. You're producing tons of inflammation when you're strength training. As long as your parasympathetic job is doing its job and turn that off, and you're giving yourself a chance to recover, then you will see kind of a normal steady baseline of HRV. If you're starting to go the opposite direction because you're not recovering well enough and you're chronically exposed to too much loading, you will see that trend simply because your body will start to have way more inflammation than it should. So it's also why HRV correlates to life expectancy and cardiovascular disease, all these things, because these are all systemically chronic inflammation that happens over years and years of time.
Speaking of inflammation, so when I was doing the 880 everyday deadlift challenge, remember I was pushing my weight as high as I could, trying to just eat well in the training cycle going into it. And so I know I wasn't I definitely was a point where I was struggling to put on any more weight when I started that. Over those 17 days, I put on almost 10 pounds. And within the week of cessation of stopping the challenge, that 10 pounds fell right back off. It was definitely inflammation, because that was a pretty crazy event.
Oh, yeah.
But I knew it was my weight because I went from 275 to 285 over the course of 2.5 weeks.
Yep.
And I knew I wasn't putting on gains.
Yep. Well, people always talk.
And then I quit doing it. And there was no changes to diet, supplementation, nothing. It was just training, and I put on 10 pounds, 2.5 weeks, and then
came right off. Yeah,
as soon as I quit
reaction
doing it,
to all that stress.
It's you wouldn't normally see that much inflation in such a short period of time. But
your
it was
whole
a
body
crazy
was just
but it was body was no. This
Probably
is
would have
good.
broken the app.
Yeah.
Plugged it in.
Yeah, well, we just had someone send me data from a 75-mile run, so we've seen some pretty. She's a local athlete, in Becky Rogers. She's essentially going to try to break the record for the Pacific Crest Trail, down the entire West Coast, and she's going to try and break the all-time record of how many days that's been done in. I mean, if you look, it's 2,500 or 3,000 miles. I think 2,500 something miles in 40 days or whatever. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but you see some crazy performances and what the body is capable of. But again, you have to build it up to that capacity, and then you just have to be a little bit nuts to do it and hope that nothing breaks along the way.
Yep.
I mean, that's what it comes down to.
Or be okay when things do break because you know that's what you were doing.
Yeah, exactly. But like I said, HRV it's interesting because it does correlate to all these different areas. And again, your average powerlifter, they don't need to have the HRV of MMA athlete or a combat. They don't need that level of aerobic fitness. But if their goal is to train, they also don't want to see this big decline either. And if their goal is to live beyond 50, which hopefully most of them do, you want to have some level of aerobic fitness in there just because, again, it's important for survival and health.
Yeah, there's quite a few powerlifters who keel over around 50,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
probably useful as a
Seems to be the
biomarker.
magic number,
Yeah.
No, I've been actually considering it for some time because just a little morning cardio is
Makes a
very
difference.
significantly linked to some
Not dying?
positive changes
Yeah.
and not dying, basically. But there's plenty of research validating.
Yeah,
that.
I get.
So I'm I've been thinking about that, and I just haven't made the shift to doing it.
Yeah.
So,
There's probably a threshold you can train in where it's not going to impact your training, but you'll get 80% of the benefit of it.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
finding find that line is, again, that's where HRV can help you, because if you're starting to go too far up, that's actually probably not necessarily a good thing. But I definitely get frustrated when you hear strength coaches or people in the industry be like, oh, you don't need any cardio, you can do this with circuit training, and you don't worry about it, you can get all these benefits for the heart with just getting your heart rate up during lifting. No, you can't actually.
it's not quite the same.
It's not
thing,
quite
no.
the same thing. And we've seen how many lifters and a certain well-known strength coach die fairly recently from cardiovascular related problems. It's not that simple. You actually do need some lower threshold work where you don't have this high blood pressure, because the difference being, if I'm lifting and doing a cardiovascular circuit, by circuit training, my blood pressure is high, and that causes different effects on the heart itself and the vascular system than if my blood pressure is lower, because I'm not using such high resistances. So again, I get there's always a trade-off, right? At the far end of performance, you're going to lose health. There's no question. I don't care what sport you're doing.
Yeah.
But it's a question of, how far are you willing to go, and can we have some protection against that while still maintaining a performance level that's, acceptable to us. And some people are going to make that trade-off, and they know it, and so be it. But most people want to live past 50 or 55 and still move when they get up there. So
And most powerlifters aren't professional athletes. They have plenty going on in their outside day-to-day life. They have jobs. So measuring that variability in your recovery is probably a very valuable thing for them.
And it's one thing if you're making $100 million a year. It's another thing if you're making $100 a year, right? Those are two different goals, right?
And there's only a couple of people in the sport, like
one, probably.
I think that's about the only actually true professional powerlifter,
right?
That actually makes a living off of earnings.
Yeah, and Brandon, you mentioned the idea of using it to build better blocks too, especially on a review basis, but checking that chronic stress load over time too to make sure that, I mean, if you're just starting an off season that's planning to be easy after a hard competition prep, you don't want your stress or your heart rate variability to show that you're not in great shape recovery-wise at the beginning of this easy session, and you know that you'll probably need to pull things back a little further at the beginning. Similarly, there's times you want to dip into those harder zones of training and you know your recovery is going to be going down intentionally. There's times for that too.
You're going to see that, that measurement. And I remember this, I talked to Joel about it, like, hey, it told me I was moving into zones that I should be pulling back, but I knew this is part of my plan right now, so I'm not taking action on it. But you would see it, and you'd be like, okay, that's it. Like the HRV tool doesn't know your training plan.
Exactly.
But doesn't know that you've got an actual 3 or 4 days planned off coming up, or that this is where you're building into a peak and then you've got a deload. Like it doesn't. So you still got to use your coaching brain.
Exactly.
Over the top
you're just using data to make better decisions. That's what it comes down to. It's like someone picking the stocks. Like I can't just look at a graph and be like, oh, I should pick this one. It's looking at what the stocks are telling you and then making decisions about where you should invest your money in. Something you guys mentioned when we were doing our videos down here, which you can talk about at some point, was just this idea of your chronic load and deviations away from that chronic load. And you see that with HRV. So if I've got a chronic load, it's essentially how much load my body can respond to in a given week and it's used to being exposed to. It's when you see chronic deviations up or, interestingly enough, down away from that you see problems. If you take this normal baseline load and it's X numbers of tons or whatever, and you go 20%, 30% above it for some crazy reason, or you drop it by 23%, you see really big problems in HRV. And most people will think like, oh, I just, it's deload week, I cut off 30% of my volume. That probably for most people is way the hell too much, because what's going to happen is the following week, you're now going to go 30% back up to normal and you're going to screw yourself. And it's why immune system function changes so rapidly and why people get injured in deloads. And
I'm actually having a problem associated with that just right now. But
your problem's right here, buddy.
I know. But I remember Brandon wrote a training block for me, a meet prep block, probably 3 years ago at this point. And I remember being so ready for the deload, ready to cut everything down by 50%. And then I got it and it was barely a reduction at all. But I've adopted that and I've been doing that for quite a while. And you maintain a much higher level of fitness and tend to just feel way better when you don't completely drop out 50% of the work.
Well, I can tell you from working with combat athletes for a long, long time now is what we see is you have these ridiculously high training volumes that are established over training camp. Some are way over the top, but regardless, then you go to another city. Sometimes it's across the country, sometimes it's across the world. So you spend a day or two of traveling to get there and settle in, and then you have a weight cut, and then you fight. So you've built up this huge training volume, this huge capacity, and then literally the week right before you're performing, you're dropping a bunch of weight, which is stressful, and people cut their training back like to a third or less. They'll go to a couple sessions. They think they have to recover, and they'll spend 20 minutes hitting the pads, and that's their whole workout per day. We don't. Like our guys will hit pads or roll or grapple 3 times a day sometimes during fight week, and people are like, "What the hell? These guys are always in the gym." Yeah, because you spent the last 8 weeks always in the gym. You can't just go from that to nothing. So I think people mistake this idea that you've got to have this huge reduction in training and that's the ultimate way to stimulate recovery. No, I mean that might stimulate recovery, but it might also drop your fitness a ton and drop your preparation a ton at the same time.
That's definitely the same with the majority of our lifters as well. As I don't know if we've quite gotten known for this, but not really giving our lifters like huge deloads, but it's only because we are managing those chronic loads going into that. If you don't manage those and you just have this consistent buildup, of course you're going to have to take a deload because you're going to have some fairly significant consequences to that.
Actually, I got a question for you. I trained with you met Joe, and he was getting ready for a competition. He was kind of telling me he wanted to deload. He wanted to basically not deadlift for like 2 days or 17 days or whatever his number was. And I was like, I feel like you should be able to deadlift at lower volumes, getting closer to meet. And that seems like a really far out period to me. And I'm not a powerlifter by any stretch, but just intuitively, that's a long time to not get lifted, even from just a technique and movement pattern reinforcement and just getting some load in the CNS. That seems really far out. I'm like, I think you could still train heavier, just keep the volume obviously shorter, especially if you've been training the deadlift for that period of time. So how far out or how do you manage that?
That's going to vary a bit individually, and I'll let Brandon or Brady jump in on that. Because I was going to go another direction, but
it definitely matters individually, but not as much as people think. Just because you're not deadlifting with your huge adaptive loads, you can still deadlift at least 70% and do some technique work. This is like a very old school, and it kills me every time because you wrote an article probably 5 or 6 years ago that
that's even old. I wrote that.
It causes me problems weekly with people emailing me.
That's like 10 years ago. Like, I wrote that for Breaking Muscle, literally.
That's an old article.
Like in 2010 or something.
It's like 4-3-2-1 to peaking or something. Yeah. And it's the idea that you're going to reduce in a appreciable 25% blocks.
We should probably
delete
pull
that from the
down.
internet. I don't think you can now. Someone will message me like, "Hey, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think?" They're like, "Well, Chris did it." I was like, "Well, Chris hasn't done that." So
yeah.
But it's definitely very individualized. But I think part of the reason that we've been so successful with some of our strongest athletes is we get them to do more in less time over the course of a very long period of time. And if you look at taking 4 weeks off of deadlifting, which is not that uncommon at the very higher echelons of some of these heavyweight guys, they're taking off maybe 3 months of year of deadlifting, and the deadlifts don't really go up year to year, and that to me is probably a part of it. But it really depends on, it seems like it depends on the size of the lifter, and it depends how much strength they've gained over their career and maybe age. If we have a 120-pound female, we're going to deadlift heavy, probably max out on a Wednesday before the meet. Yep. My youngest athlete and also one of my lightest athletes who won USAPL Nationals as a teen 363 kilo lifter, she did an entire meet on the Wednesday before her Saturday meet and PR'd in all lifts. Now, that's not going to be true for Dr. Rudolph, who is 70 years old. He's probably going to have to take a week off or so and let himself rest. But I do think
he's competing this coming weekend, right?
Yeah.
So he was in training yesterday, and I know that he's got a little bit more work planned this week. Mm-hmm. But lighter than what we would have most of our athletes.
And I think that's one of the biggest myths in powerlifting right now is that you have to take so much time off or you won't feel ready. It's like you should probably do some more in that time. It doesn't mean you need to train normally, but you should probably have managed your training well enough to this point that you can. There's a reason people can PR in the middle of training blocks just randomly. They don't need to take a week off and then it's going to happen. In fact, sometimes can add a significant variable into that mix as well, as we found.
I remember it was either talking to Brent Mikesell. You probably don't even, do you remember him?
I know the name.
So he's a Washington guy.
He was a Washington guy. He was the biggest squatter in the world, back in the day. And probably would have had one of the biggest totals, but he was missing a finger. So he couldn't quite break the 800-pound deadlift, but he was, in his day, he was the guy.
He was a monster, yeah.
And he was talking about how everybody takes all this time off. He's like, I don't feel good unless I squat heavy on Wednesday before a meet. He'd come in and hit a heavy session. That was when nobody was doing that. Mm-hmm. But he's like, I just don't feel that. But I was going to talk on the the body's response. Yep. You're talking about inflammation, other stuff, but we did with the certification that we're adding some content and we're doing some stuff on soft tissue. And so we have in-house people that do that here. Any of them that work on me can tell you, my body, significantly changes for the worse if I don't train. You'd think that, you're going to be tighter. You're going to be, if I take a few days off from training, everything starts tightening up. I get immobile. Actually, training keeps me mobile and moving.
I would say the higher level athlete I've seen, the more training they need to maintain it. I mean, it makes sense, right? They're at this higher level, so they need this constant stimulus. But
my rib cage will start locking down, which starts affecting my breathing patterns. The shoulders start tightening up. Yep. Everything when I take time off.
Yeah, what's interesting too here, and I think kind of part of peaking is finding this balance. So there's this paper they did many years ago where they essentially had these people do 1RM maxes. I think it was a leg press or something, but it was literally a 1RM every day for 10 days or 2 weeks or whatever it was. And in that period of time, their peak 1RM strength went down 5%, but their power went down 36%. So what they did, obviously they didn't lose a ton of muscle mass. It was way too short a period of time. And you might think, well, it was just CNS fatigue. Well, actually people obviously know CNS is important, but they looked at essentially the cells that the sympathetic hormones like adrenaline bind to, and those cells had decreased by like 40 to 50%. So essentially what you find is that it's not just the muscle contracting, it's the adrenaline attaching to those muscles and other hormones to cause it to contract and produce more force. Well, if we're doing maximal effort lifting, we're constantly bombarding the muscle with all these sympathetic stress hormones that help us produce more force. And eventually the body's like, hey, like I don't need all this hormone all the damn time, so it decreases its receptor count. And so when it does that, even though the CNS might be capable of firing the muscle, because it's desensitized itself to these sympathetic hormones, it's going to not produce nearly as much force and power. I mean, a 30% loss in power in a couple of weeks is insane, right? And even a 5% loss in 1RM. So people always talk about max effort lifting and they think of the CNS. Well, the autonomic nervous system is driving that as much as anything else because it's producing the hormones. So I think part of what happens when you taper is if you've done that to yourself, then maybe some of that taper gives those receptors a chance to repopulate or upregulate back to normal, and then boom, now you can produce what you need.
It's a whole nother discussion, but I'll just give my 2 cents on that. Like what people describe as CNS fatigue, like I understand what they're describing, but like true like CNS fatigue is not, in my opinion, not CNS fatigue. Like basically your CNS controls like your heart beating, your lungs breathing, all this sort of stuff. If it's fatiguing, you're close to death. So this is like, but norepinephrine, GABA, like all these neurotransmitters either being reduced or the receptors being blunted is what people are having. Like that is what's driving it.
Yeah,
and it's this general feeling of malaise and lack, like all this stuff happens as an output of that. And it's going to be different from one person to another depending on, again, some of the, that individual neurology of what's getting depleted or blunted for them. But there's 7 different types of those neurotransmitters, and any of those that get affected are that's CNS fatigue. But it's actually your CNS is still actually functioning just fine. So
I think
that's
ultimately what we have to look at is if you chronically expose the body to high load stress, the body's reaction is like decrease force and power output and make you stop doing that and want to eat and rest. Like it's driving you biologically to expend less energy and eat more. Like that's what's going to drive you to do. And you experience that as a feeling of fatigue or hunger or lack of motivation. I mean, all those things are just driven by the body's response to stop doing that. This sucks. I don't like it. So and some people override that and keep going. And
like all these, that's actually what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. It's dopamine. The whole dopamine system is another fascinating thing we talk about. But it changes the reward from like I want to go crush some weights.
So I don't really correct people when they say CNS fatigue because I know what they're describing, but technically it's a little bit different. Again, that's my take based on my understanding of the research that
I think I agree. It's a whole host of factors that are driving that. It's not just one system in the body. It's the whole body's response to stop doing that. To me, this sucks. So
one of those biological responses is probably what you were describing, and that decreased sensitivity to adrenaline. That's probably a litany of biological factors.
It's the same thing with cortisol. You can bombard your body with cortisol all day long from sympathetic activity, and then you get cortisol resistance, and then you can't shut off inflammation, and that's how you end up with chronic inflammation. So that's why if you make people train too much and you expose them to the cold virus, they get sick.
Yeah,
like there's all sorts of things like that.
But different people have different responses to that. Some people are going to be more susceptible to that than others.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of that comes down to genetics and training history and all those sorts of things. But I always think it's fascinating to try to just not understand the response, but like biologically, why does that happen? And it always comes down to, there's a great quote by this professor Herman Ponzer that life is a game of turning energy into babies. And literally, he's right. I mean, all of our motivation comes down to staying alive and reproducing. I mean, literally, if you look at 90% of human behavior,
staying alive and flying healthy.
Exactly.
But whatever.
Exactly.
Also, same for you, getting the vasectomy. It's just staying alive now. I don't know.
Hey, the world told me what needs to happen.
If you go back,
I got to reschedule. Because being 42 and having 3, plus you jump to 4. Like people don't think about this. Like that's 5 people. Well, no, 6 people in a car. Like you got to like get a minivan or a Suburban or like different like logistics, like really freaking
you just go from like
once you go
piston helicopter,
once you
turbo
go that one
helicopter,
extra,
You need that third row seat.
exactly. All of a sudden, things like change hugely from a logistics standpoint.
Yeah.
So that's definitely
yeah, I
into
believe you.
consideration.
Yeah.
Never
So-
thought about that, but
so
I believe I might someday.
Yeah, like I said, if you need to fly your family, you'd have to go a whole nother class of helicopter to fit them all in there. Like,
Hey,
there's no way you're fitting them in mine.
somebody came in having that discussion
Yeah.
when we came up to visit you.
Yeah.
Because he had his
Yeah.
family was too big, and he's like, "What helicopter do I get?" And you're like, "Yeah, you're pretty screwed."
Yeah, I mean, he had like a family of 6. Like,
Like,
you have to step
know.
your game up to like an EC. I mean, now you're dropping $2,000 an hour to fly your family around when you
Hey,
could have done
you
it
really
for
screwed up, guy.
a quarter of that.
Yeah.
Didn't plan ahead. It's not good family planning.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't think around like, why didn't you review helicopter specs
Yeah.
before you decided to have another child? Like,
Yeah, it's really a first world problem. I have to admit. I mean, about as first world problem as it possibly
that
gets.
is
Like,
that is it.
that's never lost on me. I'm kind of like I'm flying over, lots of people, and you look at how what we're doing is amazing, and you think about like kids in the world. Like, I wish I had some water right now. It's sad that there's just this disparity, but it's one of those things that reminds you just it's a first world problem. You start talking about, damn, my helicopter's too small for my family.
But I think the moral of this whole podcast was less kids, more helicopters.
I'm with you. Yes.
Well, we're going to be bumping close to time, so a couple things to talk about. When do you want to take the lead on talking about some of the work that we're going to be doing with Joel?
Yeah, no, we just got done wrapping up about a day's worth of filming, which probably is going to translate to a little over an hour and a half worth of actual content. But we contributed our lecture plus practical application, and the title was Tissue Load Tolerance. We discussed some of the things that we did in the podcast today in terms of how does chronic load influence your actual tissues, how does spikes and reductions in acute loads influence that, we got into a little bit of sleep, and then we were very practical with here are some actual methods and tools that you can use to positively influence tissue manipulation to hopefully maintain that and be healthier, train more, and be stronger.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I really appreciate you guys doing that. I think, again, people inherently think of strength training, and that's where they think, oh, I might beat up and lifting, I got to get all the soft tissue work, and they think less of that by the conditioning side, but it doesn't matter. Anytime you're moving, and I don't care what the hell you're doing, like, you are causing systemic changes to the soft tissue that need to be addressed. And I realized, we talked a lot. I had Mike Robertson and Bill Hartman in my certification talk about breathing and that tie-in, but there really wasn't a soft tissue component. And I love what you guys are doing. I've been using it myself now and see the benefits directly and with everyone I'm working with. So it was awesome to get that component put in the certification so people can have an idea of, how do we manage soft tissue therapy? How do we facilitate better breathing and mobility? And then, again, if you're conditioning, you're doing tons of repetitions of running or sprinting or, whatever, boxing, you're doing so many reps that soft tissue matters a lot, and it really makes a big difference. Take care of your soft tissue. I think soft tissue management and sleep are probably the two most important things that people can do if their goal is, hey, I want to be able to sustain what I'm doing over the long haul. If you're not getting good sleep and you're not maintaining your soft tissue, you're a ticking time bomb. You're going to fall apart. It's really, inevitable. It's just a question of how long you can last. So, I'm really excited to have that in the start. Like you said, it'll be hour and a half, whatever, but it'll just help provide some context for people that are in the conditioning realm, whether they're coaches or athletes, of the big picture of conditioning. Because again, people tend to have this idea that conditioning is like, oh, I'm just going to run some intervals and that's conditioning. No, that's not conditioning any more than just saying, I'm going to go throw some weights up. It's, strength and power work. There's a lot more to it. So I talk about movement, mobility, and energy systems, all these things tying together. So I'm really excited. And I know the people that have been in certification, obviously people are going to go through the certification. They're going to have access to this whole new paradigm and all these tools that you guys obviously are familiar with that a lot of people aren't yet and need to be in terms of how they take care of themselves to continue training. Because you know what? The best way to get better is to stay healthy enough to keep training.
Yep.
I mean, it's that simple. You're only as good as your ability to train. And if you start breaking down, then I don't care how good your program is if you can't actually do it. So,
And it's completely online.
all online. Yeah. Well, so we have two parts. We have one. The main course is all online. You get a workbook. We go through hours of video with guys like yourself, and like Mike and Bill and some other guys. But then each year, as part of that, I essentially decided to put on a free workshop in Seattle. It's 2 days for anyone across the world that's certified. We've had people from Australia, New Zealand, Europe. Last year, we had 2 Germans in the same town show up and attend each other completely randomly. So it was cool to see. But we have basically a free live workshop that is part of the course as well that you can come to every single year. And I've just started adding a 30-minute call every month as well. So my goal is really educate people about conditioning and coaches in particular. But then, it's not over once you've completed the course. I want to have continued learning. So that was really my philosophy behind that is, continue to support it and continue to add this new material. I mean, the course has been out for 2 years, but as I am exposed to new areas and pick things up like you guys, I want to continue to add that in to make it better.
Where can people find more about you and 8 Weeks Out?
Yep. Well, 8 Weeks Out. It's probably the easiest way. So just 8weeksout.com. There's stuff about Morpheus at trainwithmorpheus.com. We have a new band that we're developing that you can start pre-ordering now. The certification is going to be launching to the public May 28th. It opens twice a year for about a week. It's the precision nutrition style, and we let everybody in and then close the doors. But May 28th, I believe, is when the cert will launch. So you can just 8weeksout.com. There's a certification on the nav. And again, I'm really thankful and appreciative of you guys for taking the time to do that. I know everyone's going to love it, and I'm excited to get it out there.
Yeah, we are too.
Been an absolute pleasure having you on. So
awesome. Thanks for having me down, and time to fly home. Beat the traffic.